Hey, this is Rick with Inwyt Walkabout, and I wanted to thank you for joining me today on another excursion through the neighborhood. It's a spring day here in the Northeast. We're in that space where the weather is sometimes warm, sometimes cold. Here's a view of what spring looks like right now. Really not a whole lot of green or signs of new life yet. But we're all excited for the sustained warmth and better weather that is on the way. I wanted to continue our conversation today based on our conversation last time, where we were looking at the example of external barriers, if you will, using East German as, sort of an inside-out created literal prison of a country back then, with a wall surrounding the country that nobody could really get in or out of with free will. And I wanted to explore with you how, when we're faced with external barriers like that, particularly in extremes, but think about this in your daily life where it may not be so visible, and how we all have different approaches to how we manage our external environment and the constraints that are imposed on us. And so I'll continue with that East German analogy and share some of the approaches that relatives at the time took to deal with that, as well as just friends and people that I was exposed to at the time when I was visiting. And it went from extremes, from certain people in the town where many of my relatives lived in East Germany, who were truly afraid of Western influence and really saw the wall and the separation of East and West Germany as a protective wall from these influences, the evil influences of the West, the capitalist influences and so forth, and who, to an extent, embraced the hardships, if you will, because of the security that provided in how they perceived their overall lives. And then, there were other members, probably a larger group than that, who were afraid of the government and the power that the government had to really influence external daily living. And particularly if you didn't go along with, party dogma, doctrine, and expectations, you could be significantly penalized in many ways that would make your life difficult. And then there was another group, which I had an uncle who was quite entrepreneurial and who saw the limitations of the East German government and economy, and took the approach of saying, yeah, it's not a good system, but it's what I have to work with, and I'm going to do the best that I can to make it work for me. And so he was very astute in participating sort of in a superficial way to be favorably viewed by the government and the industry as being a compatriot of the cause, while at the same time always looking for opportunities for entrepreneurship and sort of developing his own interests. And he was very successful in doing that. And then more common for my relatives was probably the larger group that essentially refused to be a part of the system and said, we will not embrace the doctrines and the so-called democratic view, even though it was democratic socialist view of how the country was run, and really at great expense to themselves, both from an education standpoint as well as from a career standpoint, essentially refused to go along with party line, and had really very little options to do anything meaningful or to find a protected space, if you will, for living other than having some sort of a role with the church, which was still a fairly strong institution at the time, and for which the government, had to tolerate, begrudgingly, I would say, because they just couldn't eliminate that. And so I had a lot of relatives who became pastors or had some sort of a role within theological institutions like libraries, where they made things work for themselves and kind of plodded on in that regard. I also had some relatives who just got to a point where they couldn't tolerate it anymore and basically took it upon themselves to escape, and had some pretty adventurous experiences getting out of the country illegally and making it across, and also paid some consequences for that by not being able to go back to East Germany, and they left their family behind, and that was also a difficult choice to make. And finally, I think as history shows, East Germany, in the context of what was going on in the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, started to become increasingly rebellious and intolerant of the government and the way they were running the country. And over a relatively short period of time, in the late 80s, there was enough of a national movement and uprising where in 1989 the government essentially lost control of its population, and the Berlin Wall came down, and all of a sudden you had reunification of East and West Germany in a way that was really not very organized, and for which initially there was great enthusiasm on both sides, but after which became a significant challenge to figure out how to realign two parts of a country that were initially together, and how to bring them back after significant changes in government, lifestyle, and so forth, and for which all of a sudden the people in East Germany who were excited about the new beginning and the new opening had to face considerable uncertainty. And all of a sudden, the mental models and the worldviews and experiences and traditions and so forth didn't align with what they had become accustomed to and where they were now headed. And so, again, a lot of fear, uncertainty emerged from that. And people had a really hard time trying to figure out how to all of a sudden change the way that they worked, the way that they lived. It was much more of a capitalist society. A lot of the safety nets, if you will, that existed in the former East Germany were no longer there, and it became a really difficult time. And so people, again, started to reach back to their mental models, their ways of thinking and looking. And while they were struggling to reintegrate, there was also considerable concern that I think still is present even today about saying, maybe it wasn't so bad back when we were East Germany, and maybe we need to find a way to go back to the way things were then. Not necessarily create an East Germany, but basically rethink how the principles and the approaches that East Germany took might be brought back. So what's the point behind this? Well, when you look at the external barriers that people face, or the opportunities, just the way people live, we always troubled, I think, by the perception of external constraints to what we want to do. And there are many different ways that every one of us kind of create our own boxes, if you will, our own little spheres of comfort or spheres of discomfort that we know that we cling to. And in many ways, as we talked about before, these are our respective individual prisons that we contain ourselves in. We can expand, we can contract them, but there's a comfort zone that we all tolerate. And when something profoundly shifts externally, and we have a propensity to always look at the outside as the problem, and all of a sudden you get an opportunity like a wall coming down in East Germany, and there's something completely new, we don't know how to handle it because we're still caught in the thought process that creates the external and the internal constraints. And that's our thought box, right? Of basically, again, perception, identification, interpretation, imagination, and sort of a reactive response. And so we end up essentially not being able to get out because we don't understand the fundamental mechanisms that sit under all of this. And, then our safety net is always to go back to the way things were. And you can see that playing out in our own country to a large extent, and you can see it playing out globally because we're always looking for something that either we think is new, but ultimately ends up being something that's old that we're comfortable with or comfortably uncomfortable with because we know it. So I'm giving you extreme examples, but think about how in your daily lives you go through and how often we are always complaining or aspiring to the ideal, to some idea of what should be and where we want to ultimately end up. And aside from that never ending is when we actually hit a target, it doesn't change anything because then we have to either say, is this really what we wanted? Did it align with expectations, which many times it doesn't, or it immediately generates something new. Now I have to go for the next target, right? And then we never get out of this thought process of essentially the boxes that we create as a result. So take a look at your work environment, take a look at your family environment, just take a look at your living situation and reflect on how often we continue to just apply our boxiness internally to the external and how they always influence each other. So that's it for today. I'll leave you with a view here of, again, sort of a early spring. Not much green here, as you can see. I hope you have a great day, a wonderful week, and I look forward to next time. This is Rick with Inwyt Walkabout. Take care.